If you want, we can just leave it. Naomi, can you? Thank you so much. Okay. Okay. Let's go. Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? Perfect. Good evening and welcome back to the Cambridge Union for our first physical debate in half a year. Before I introduce our first speaker who will open the case for the proposition, I think it might make sense to go through a few house rules. The first is that can we please avoid any flash photography or videography. This event will be open to the public and available to everyone to watch online afterwards. And secondly, I think I'll just run through how you can get involved in the debate. So whilst our physical in-person speakers are offering their remarks, after the first minute of their speech, you can interject by saying on that point or point of order, and it's up to the speaker to decide whether or not to take your interjection. We ask that you preferably avoid interjecting in virtual speakers because that will prove a bit tricky technically. In between our longer formal speeches, there'll be the opportunity to make floor speeches for the proposition, the opposition, and abstention. And we ask that you make those from the points that the stewards indicate. So let's get started. Tonight we're discussing this House would break up big tech. Opening the case for the proposition virtually is Professor Tommaso Valitelli, who is a professor of economics at Imperial Business School and also a professor of economics at the University of Rome. Professor, the floor is yours.
And I'm so excited to be here in person, first in-person event since last October, so it's fantastic. And it's fantastic in particular to talk about such an important topic, breaking up big techs. So big tech, let me start from a very brief overview of what happened in the past 20 years. So big tech, you have to think about 2 decades. The first decade was incredible. It was disruptive, new companies were coming in. You know, the Google, the Facebook, the Amazon started back then, 20 years ago. And you should remember that this started also when competition authorities did something. They didn't do that to the very extreme, but they tried to break up Microsoft. Okay? Because in the late 90s, there was a dominant firm that was Microsoft that was trying to dominate everything else in the web. Back then it was the browsers, it was the media players, it was other stuff going on. Okay? There was a case brought in front of the Department of Justice in the US, and then they decided to settle. But then the European Commission also imposed big fines in the early 2000s, and Microsoft stopped doing what it was doing, which was trying to monopolize the entire World Wide Web, which is how it was called back then. And then the Sergey Brin, the Page, these guys came around, and they did incredible things for 10 years. But then there is the second decade. And the second decade is another one where, as expected, I'm an economist, and as expected because of economies of scale, because of network externalities, monopolization came along again. A few numbers. In the past 10 years, not just last year, in the past 10 years, 95% of searches in the European Union, including the UK, were conducted using one search engine. 90% of people on social media above the age of 30, so that's not this audience, are on Facebook. E-commerce, think about the pandemic, how dependent we are on those companies. And how did this come along? It came along because they were good, obviously, on its own merit, but it also came for several other forces. One was a total inaction on the regulator side. The United States, after this case I mentioned in the late 90s, stopped enforcing anything in the tech space. This is not just under Trump. It started well before that with President Obama. So they did nothing. Maybe because these are American companies, who knows. Nothing was done. These companies also grew not just organically by doing stuff, but by buying other companies. A few numbers would help as well. In the past 20 years, the GAFAM, so that's Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft, bought 1,000 companies. They bought instead of doing. They bought other companies. And how many of those transactions have been blocked? Do you know the answer? It's zero. Zero. No merger has ever been blocked by any competition authorities globally since the inception of this big tech kind of thing. Okay? More worrying to me is that of those 1,000+ acquisitions, because we're still counting, 97% were not even vetted by the competition authorities. They completely escaped the attention for several reasons. Okay? They were not even looked into. That's not a good situation we are finding ourselves in. Or our lives, when we communicate, when we shop online, when we write, when we browse a website, the type of information we can obtain, the type of information we are being presented is all dominated by a few companies. This is not good for competition. This is not good for democracy, I would say. This is not the system we want to find ourselves. That's very dangerous. It's very dangerous to have a company such as Facebook, which has 2.7 billion users across the world, and they can dictate whether a certain piece of news is shown to you or not. It's not good to have this kind of concentration. And think about it. My message tonight is going to be for competition, not for regulation as such, but we want to inject, again, that kind of competition that we had 20 years ago, and we have incredibly lost. And to do that, there are several things we can do. One thing, and this is a great moment, is to wake up the enforcers. Okay? This is happening. This is a great moment. The narrative in the US has changed dramatically with the Biden administration. We will see if actions correspond to the words now, but at least the nominations to the Federal Trade Commission, to the Department of Justice, are all the right people you would expect to have in position of power now. There is a new debate happening also at the level of the European Union with something called the Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, so regulations which are meant to come in place, and I will explain what kind of regulations. And the UK has a very brave enforcer, the Competition and Markets Authority, which is currently led by an Italian like me, so it has to be a great enforcer. And this is really one of the best competition authorities in the world as we speak, which is good. So it's a great period. It's a great moment in time to be in the UK and witness these kind of things. And we need multilateralism because this is a global problem. So you cannot expect that the UK alone or the EU alone or the US alone can actually put a stop to what's going on. So this is on the enforcer side. And on the enforcer side, what we are proposing is to do something fairly decent. So if you think about yourselves, you are changing your mobile contract, sure you are, and still also in mobile telephony there is those big economies of scale, those network externalities that would call for concentration. And we knew that, okay? But we understood the economics and we imposed very sensible regulations so that when you change your mobile phone, your mobile contract, you just keep your number. You can just keep all your contacts, and that's a very pro-competitive. An entrant would stand a chance if you want to change. Now, imagine if you have the greatest idea among you, a student in computer science, they have the best search engine ever, unbiased, that really gets to the consumers what they want, stands no chance in that space. You probably, when you received the new terms of service, very strange terms of service from WhatsApp a few months ago, you probably accepted. Those of you who were a bit uncomfortable, maybe you started downloaded Signal or Telegram or alternatives, and maybe some of you actually did that, but did you actually use it? To use it, you need actually to convince all your friends to join the same platforms as yours, because they are not interconnected. There is no interoperability. There is no data portability. So this is a concept that we have applied in telecoms. We have applied in banking. We have applied in other industries. Let's apply them also when it comes to big tech. Why big tech should follow a different pattern? That's not clear to me at all. And then we should change the merger side. We shouldn't allow Facebook to gobble up yet again another company. This is the most almighty company in the world, isn't it? They have the most amazing resources. Why, instead of competing on the merit, they can purchase some potential other companies that can turn themselves into rivals or can be bought by other companies and then become a credible threat to the biggest incumbents in the world. This has to change, and the proposal is also there. It's called structural presumption. So you should change the burden of proof. You should tell, guys, you're Google, the super dominant firm, a systemically dominant firm, a gatekeeper, you can use the jargon you want. The lawyers can come up with the best definition ever. And because you're so big, I don't expect any consumer surplus arising from your new transaction buying another company. I will presume this is unlawful unless, and this is the rebuttable side, you can prove to society that you really need to buy that company in order to deliver something which is good for society itself. Rebuttable structural presumption. Last but not least, let's break them up. And why should we break them up? Because many of the problems that we have encountered, many of the problems of the antitrust cases that we tried in Europe to run in the past few years. I was the chief economist of the European Commission until 2019, and I ran a case, Google for shopping, Google for Android, Google for AdSense, Amazon Marketplace. These cases are taking years and years because these companies come back with the best lawyers, the best resources. We don't have, as enforcers, the same resources to be in front of companies which are worth trillions of dollars in market capitalization. These are numbers we cannot even imagine how big the economic and political power of these companies. So break them up because they have the structural incentives to abuse of the market power that they have acquired. And if the problem is in the structure, the solution must come from affecting the very structure itself. If the problem of abuse comes from Google self-preferencing its own properties so that they can make more money on advertising, we have to affect that structure. If the problem with Amazon comes from the fact that they can offer a platform, they are both a referee but also a player because they also compete against the people they attract on their platform, the problem lies in the structure. So we should affect the structure by breaking them up. So which breakups? There are many. I can just suggest a few we can start from. Facebook, Instagram. Facebook was allowed to buy Instagram, and no analysis was done back then. Facebook was allowed to buy WhatsApp. And we have the documents because of the UK Parliamentary Commission. Facebook acquired a company called Onavo, an Israeli software company, a spyware that you would have on your mobile phone, on your smartphone. And this Onavo would tell you they would just put your files together, but in fact they were actually looking at how you were using, which apps you were using on your phone, and then would provide this market intelligence to whoever wanted to buy that market intelligence. With the purchase of Onavo, Facebook could see the numbers and could see that whoever was, they realized that in the moment of time, they had a service called Messenger, but WhatsApp was going better, and they used the information actually to say, actually, WhatsApp is a very serious competitor, let's buy them. And so they did. So with this kind of information, we have to reverse the merger that we have allowed back then. There is another one, Google double-click. All the ad tech space is monopolized because bad decision we had in the past. The most recent one I tried with other economists to be very vocal against the European Commission has been Google Fitbit. Why do we want Google to enter a new market for health, for insurance? Why should Google know about our health data when this can have serious consequences in terms of the discriminatory way that people are going to be treated in the health and insurance market? So, ladies and gentlemen, let's break them up. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for opening the case for the proposition. We now turn to our first speaker for the opposition, who's going to appear virtually on the screens in front of us, Baroness Nikki Morgan, who was the Conservative MP for Loughborough from 2010 to 2019 and now sits in the House of Lords. She also served around the Cabinet table as Secretary of State for Education and Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. The floor is yours.
Well, Mr. President, thank you very much indeed for the invitation to speak to you all this evening. I'm sorry I'm not there in person, but I will offer you my congratulations on reopening and allowing a socially distanced audience, which I know is not quite the same thing as you're all used to, but it is great to see the Cambridge Union back in at least a hybrid form. Now, we just heard a great set of arguments about the problems caused by tech companies, or the fact that governments over the years, including the European Commission, have failed to get ahead of the growth in the tech companies. But tonight's event, or at least the three of us who are speaking to you virtually, would not be doing so were it not for a tech company, namely Zoom. And that is a tech company which some of you might have heard of before the pandemic, but I certainly haven't. To Zoom has now become basically a verb. And of course, there are many different platforms that we could have chosen to use this evening. But actually, here is one that suddenly leapfrogged over others because it offered a fantastic service and is now something that is used the world over. And I would argue has leapfrogged over things like Microsoft Teams in terms of reliability and usability. So the tech market is ever changing and growing and competitive. And my task tonight is to open the case for the opposition to the motion and to show why actually breaking up the tech companies, which may come from perfectly legitimate reasons, actually is the wrong thing to do now, given where those companies are. And it is true to say, exactly as Professor Valetti said, that during the pandemic, the use of tech has enabled the survival of many businesses. It has enabled education, probably of many of the people sitting in the audience tonight. And it's also tackled things like loneliness. It's not the same, clearly, seeing people via a screen, but for many of us, it was the way to see friends and family when we were prohibited from doing so. Now, I'm not here to defend big tech. As Digital Secretary, I was very much behind the moves for the online safety bill, which is due to be introduced into Parliament shortly. But I do have to say that breaking up will not achieve what I think the proposition are going to put forward in their case to you this evening. Now, in the time available, I want to make 4 arguments as to why the proposition have got this wrong. So the first is, let's understand what is the problem that the proposition want to solve by breaking up big tech companies. Previously, when you've had a monopoly business, the reason for breaking up has been lack of competition. It has been that actually services are too expensive because there isn't sufficient competition in the market for consumers. But big tech has broken the mold on that because, of course, for many tech companies, not all, but for many tech companies, and Professor Valetti mentioned Facebook as being a particular company he wanted to target, Facebook services are free. We'll come on to obviously how they actually pay for the services in a moment. So it's not that the price is a barrier to entry either for others or for the consumers. If the issue is that we feel that big tech companies aren't paying their way, they're not contributing to taxation, well, actually, there is movement now. And with the new Biden administration, we are, I think, going to see a digital tech tax at some point in the not too distant future. And the other question the proposition have to answer tonight is, how big is too big? Are we talking amounts of data that these companies collect? Are we talking amounts of users? Are we talking numbers of employees? At what point are we going to say, no, this company is too big and needs to be broken up? The second argument I want to make tonight is that, of course, their product for many of the tech companies is us. It's our data that these companies want. And Professor Valetti quite rightly pointed to various mergers that he has an issue with, that the antitrust authorities have wanted to tackle. He talked about Google Fitbit, he talked about Facebook and Instagram. But my argument tonight, and I think the argument for the opposition, will be that the big tech companies are so very different from the monopolies that we have seen before. Because these aren't infrastructure companies. These aren't railway companies where you can offer routes to other people. These aren't companies that are offering energy products where actually you could potentially have other suppliers. And the fact is that actually what these companies have done, the big tech companies, is they have offered products and services that their users want. I think many users actually want to be able to use up joined up services. They want to be able to use Instagram and Facebook and Twitter and other ways, WhatsApp, for example. And there are ways of solving issues like the data portability argument that Professor Valetti made. The Internet of Things is going to make our lives much easier. And in some cases, quite simply, it's going to make life safer, being able to run your home, perhaps even before you have got there. And of course, fintech companies, for example, and there are many other tech companies I could point to, are actually making our lives also easier by giving us more choice in terms of banking and payment services in ways that we wouldn't even have dreamed about a few years ago. So this is a growing and changing market all the time. Now, if we have an issue with the main product being our data, then let's talk about that. Let's make people more data literate. Let's explore concepts like data trusts so that people actually have more control over who has their data, how long they have it for. The European Commission has, of course, been world leading in introducing the General Data Protection Regulation and enhancing data privacy. And the reason I say the world leading is they're first to do it, but also because we see so many US states now trying to copy and to go down the data privacy route. Those are things that can be enhanced, and breaking up the tech companies is not going to help in terms ultimately, for example, of protecting our personal data. If we have an issue with the data sets that the companies are using, with issues with bias or discrimination, then let's look at that. The UK's just launched its national data strategy. And actually what we've seen during the pandemic is that the sharing of data in many cases absolutely has made a critical difference to improving healthcare and getting services to the most vulnerable at their hour of greatest need. My third argument tonight, and Professor Valetti sort of went down this track and then pulled back, I don't have an issue with the regulation of big tech companies. I think that governments, and I've said this before, I think governments around the world have allowed these companies to grow, to be the size, to be the influencers that they are today, and are very late to the party in terms of regulation. But that has now changed. If we think that, and Professor Valetti again pointed to the impact on democracy, he pointed to the impact on news consumption. If we have an issue with the content that the user-generated content that tech companies, social media platforms are putting out, then let's regulate the type of content and the way that can be challenged and taken down. And I'm very mindful as I do that, the slide that came up at the beginning was about the Cambridge Union being the home of free speech. There is, of course, a massive debate to be had, which we will have in Parliament later on this year, about the balance between regulating content and freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But let's have that debate. Let's not go in heavy-handed and just say these companies are too big. We're not going to worry about their content. We're just going to break them. We're going to break them up. And my fourth argument tonight is, again, Professor Valetti talked about this quite rightly, which is this House, rather than breaking up the tech companies, should be pushing for greater competition. It should be pushing for reducing the barriers to entry into these markets. These tech companies are disruptors. If we think about what would have happened if the pandemic had struck 10 years ago, we would have found it very, very difficult as a global world to survive lockdowns in the way that we have. And for example, in the first quarter of this year, the UK economy to be only hit by 1.5%. Now, 1.5% is still too big, and we'd much rather had our economy open. But the fact is that many, many businesses, individuals, and others were able to switch to life online in a way that the tech companies enabled, and that we should appreciate how far we have come. But there have always been companies that have become big, influential, and then the market's changed. Let's look at Kodak. Just look at Blockbuster Videos. Look at the VHS video, for example, and how far again we have come. So companies will rise and companies will fall. And just because a company is big and influential now does not mean it'll be that way even in 2 or 5 years' time. We might have an issue with Amazon, and Professor Valetti mentioned them as one of the big tech companies. Again, if we have an issue with the way that Amazon does things, then let's regulate it. Let's look at what the problems are. But for many tiny businesses, being an Amazon marketplace seller is the first way they test their products and get them to market and start to build their businesses. I'm surprised that the proposition for this motion would want to take that opportunity and that chance away from those starting out in business. Our Information Commissioner Office and the Competition Markets Authority are working together to have competitive digital markets. That is what we need to see. And we, as I say, need to help new entrants through things like through things like sandboxes. And if we need to challenge the tech companies and lower those barriers to entry, for example, the Fortnite challenge to the Apple App Store, then let's enable those companies to bring those legal challenges. Let's not say that company is too big and therefore we should just break it up. So, Mr. President, just because the regulators and governments have failed to stop mergers, as Professor Valetti clearly has a cause close to his heart, that actually it's not enough. It's not going to solve the issue just breaking up. Governments and regulators have got to catch up and they've got to overtake these big tech companies. There's no point complaining about them being global influencers and important in terms of the way that we, say, consume our news, the way we vote in our elections. If we have a problem with that, then governments have an opportunity to regulate. We allow consolidation in other sectors, whether it's transport or whether it's energy. And finally, I find it extraordinary that Professor Valetti's, one of his arguments is that we should break the companies up because they have good lawyers in order to argue their cases in front of the antitrust authorities. Mr. President, it's news to me that the EU is short of lawyers, and I say that as a former lawyer myself. Breaking up the big tech companies is not the answer. Regulating them, making sure that we are watching what they're doing, that we are teaching people to appreciate and to be protective of their own data and their privacy is the way to go. But we have to support these companies that are disruptors and are innovators and that have really enabled us to pretty much do some of the things or many of the things we wanted to do over the course of the pandemic and to keep going and to come out the other side. We're not going to undo the innovation in the years of tech companies, but we can absolutely make sure that we regulate them and look out for what they're doing, influencing in the future. So I think that we have the right argument on this side of the House, which is saying, let's not break up the companies, let's promote competition, let's regulate them, and let's educate ourselves about our data and our privacy. Thank you.
Thank you, Baroness Morgan, for that powerful speech. We now move to a round of floor speeches. Now, the way this will work is that some people in our audience will raise their hands. I will choose one person from the proposition, one from the opposition, and someone who's a bit cautious and wants to abstain. And you will then be handed a microphone by our lovely stewards, and you will have 2 minutes to make your case. Do we have any takers for the proposition, people who are passionate about breaking up big tech? Okay, we'll go for you in the second row. Can you just wait until a microphone gets to you, and can you start by saying your name and college? Josh, and can we get a mic here?
Hi, everyone. This is working. Yeah, I'm Louis Van Steen from Magdalen College. So let me start by saying the web was not designed for big tech. It was not designed to handle monopolized, centralized authority, exerting their control over their users, or perhaps more appropriately, as I like to say, they're used. Despite their persistent virtue signaling and fancy advertising, big tech is really, in reality, highly discriminatory, authoritarian, and provides a net detriment to modern society. Now, these are big statements I won't entirely have time to explain in detail, but if people do, in fact, want to be exploited, as Baroness Morgan is effectively claiming in her speech, then this is really a failure of society and education that people don't, have the means to do anything else. As the first speaker on the proposition was saying, if all your friends are using Facebook, you have to use Facebook to talk to them. There are alternatives out there. The web was designed so that anyone can set up their own website instead of having a centralized Facebook. You have a network of people's simple handcrafted websites. You can put anything you want on there. You have full control. And it's not that difficult. There's a stigma around it being a difficult, fancy thing. So, just make a Facebook account and give all my data to advertisers who then use that to exploit me in return. And that's how you get true free speech, so long as it's coupled with education and access to the internet to begin with, which remains a massive problem even in this country. And a further sort of ironic point, the online safety bill, which Baroness Morgan mentioned in her speech, is nothing more than people who have no idea about how tech works, trying to impose further authoritarian control over individuals and not actually targeting the tech companies that are the real problem, the corporations that are really the problem. So a few bits of food for thought, and that is why I'll be strongly voting for the proposition this evening.
Thank you, Louis, for that floor speech for the proposition. Does anyone want to make the case for the opposition? Any takers? There are no fans of the tech companies in. I should say that there are prizes to be won. I'm told that there is a photography session as well as a makeover session, if that'll convince anyone to sell their soul to Facebook. Yeah, I think Mark is watching this. No, okay. Oh, yes, one. Over there. Can you just wait till we get a microphone to you? And can you just state your name and college as well?
Cassandra Shan, Christ College. So in opposition of breaking up big tech companies, Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal, wrote his book 0 to 1, in which he advocates for the fact that companies, when they take a product that transforms society and creates a new technology that brings society from 0, like say no internet, to 1, wow, there's internet, creating more companies, in which case more revenue for the government, more taxable income, sorry. That brings society from 0 to 1. And so therefore, he argues that, well, don't companies kind of deserve a reward? So by that logic, if we regulate these big tech companies, are we deterring other companies, future companies, from arising out of the ashes of big tech regulation, from making a big contribution to society? Yeah, so in that case, I think that there is a case to be made that big tech companies should be not regulated.
Thank you. And lastly, does anyone want to make a case for the abstention? Does anyone want to attack the wording of the motion? Is there something we're all missing? Yes, I can't quite see you, but go for it.
Hi, my name is Rajeshwari and I'm from Keys College. What I felt that this debate was really lacking was not about whether or not, to break up, but what we were really missing is about how to break it up if we are to break up big tech. And the opposition went on to talk about, how we can educate the people on how you can protect your data and so on and so forth. What about accountability of big tech? And what about the integrating platforms of big tech? We didn't hear that from the opposition. And from the proposition, what we didn't hear, or at least I did not hear, was what precedents would we be setting in whatever path we take to break up big tech. That's what I feel is missing. And if that was addressed, I'd probably be able to actually take a side more clearly. But in any way, overall, I do lean towards breaking up, but I'm yet to hear stronger arguments on how we do it. Thank you.
Thank you for that floor speech. We now move to our second round of paper speeches, and this time we're joined virtually to make the case for the proposition by Paul Tang, who is a member of the Dutch Labour Party. And as an MEP, a member of the European Parliament, he sits on the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs and is a member of the European Internet Forum, where he has called for the dismantling of the tech giants' business models. Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, President, and it's a real pleasure to have this meeting, though I would love to be with you in Cambridge, especially seeing the special setting that you are in. And indeed, I'm a member of European Parliament, and I work in the very European way to address the problems with big tech that we do by laws. That's what the European Union is good at. So I work on the Digital Services Act, Digital Market Act. But let me not start by addressing the problems with big tech, but also by seeing a market that is developing pretty well. Because some time ago, I was concerned that Netflix was the only game in town, the only provider of streaming services. But recently, I realized that at the moment I was trying to find a particular movie, that in my particular household, I think we have about 8 streaming services right now. And I had a hard time finding out where that movie was. And what I find fascinating about Netflix and the other streaming providers, be it Amazon Prime or Disney Plus, and I have some Dutch varieties too, is there's a very clear relation between the provider and the user. It's you provide a service, the service is provided, and you pay for it. And including the possibility nowadays to end that relation, right? I think Netflix was a lifesaver for many, but you can get help by Netflix and choose other providers. There are plenty of alternatives now. So there's a clear relation between the service and the price you pay for it. And the underlying reason for that, when you start to think about it, how is it possible that Netflix didn't grow into a monopoly, is because the copyrights on the raw material are more scattered. The copyrights on the movies and series are in the hands of many, meaning that it's very hard for Netflix to corner the market and gather all together and bring all together all the movies and series, and it allows for new entrants. And there's an analogy with the problem I would like to address, because if you look at the universum of Google and Facebook, it's very different. The services are still clear, right? So we use an email program, we use messaging services, social media platform, search engine, something mentioned. The service is clear, but the relation between provider and users is very opaque. The services are free, like Nicky Morgan said, but we pay a price, in terms of data. That's what we pay. Now, I may legally argue that I own my data, but I'm pretty sure I do not control them, because I don't know exactly what data are being collected where, let alone how these data are being used. Well, I have a rough understanding, but my rough understanding is that I am being tracked and followed, and that data are gathered about me. I'm being labeled, I'm being categorized, and then I'm the target then of advertisements. So I'm not just a white male. No, I'm a white male of 54 living in Amsterdam who is a fan of Star Trek, who is a fan of Bruce Springsteen and Led Zeppelin, and who is guilty pleasure it is to sing along with ABBA songs. That they all know about me. Now, that is the price I pay, but I do not know exactly, because I don't know which data are out there and how they are being used. But can I leave the universum of Google and Facebook? That's even more difficult, because they still keep following and tracking me, still be labeling and categorizing me. So I own the data, but I do not control the data. And in fact, Google and Facebook control the data and don't give access to the data, and therefore control the market of personalized ads. Estimates are that currently 1 out of every 2 digital ads is going through Google and Facebook. And in fact, their whole business model is based on ads. More than 90% of the revenue is from personalized ads. And it's not just that I, as a user, am being dominated. There's no clear relation between provider and user. It's also that the society as a whole suffers, because the profits of Google and Facebook have increased over time, making them the largest companies in the world. But the revenues for ordinary news publishers, broadcast companies, over the time has declined, leading to a deterioration in the quality of journalism. Besides, keeping their attention to gather data and to sell ads, that's the business model. And that leads to sensationalism, leads to fake news, to conspiracy theories. And what we also have seen, interference in our elections. So this is the perverse business model of Google and Facebook, and we need to stop that. And we need to stop not just saying the data are ours or we bring it back to the individual. We need to stop them using personal data for ads. That's the way to end this perverse business model, and bringing back a more clear relation between the service and the price we pay for it, allowing better autonomy for the user. So that's when I say break them up, it is that we need to have a clear relation between provider and user, and now currently it's an opaque system that we need to change. Of course, comes with that, with the dominant position of the big techs, with the sheer market power, also comes market abuse. There are plenty of examples out there, right? Classic example is Google that was trying to buy Yelp, another search engine, you could say. Yelp refused to be assimilated by Google, but hey, resistance is futile. So Google tried to suppress Yelp in the search results of Google. It's just one of the many examples of market power there is. And what you need to do is to go to the source of the market power. And often that is, for example, take the two-sided platforms of Apple and Amazon, take the function, take it up out of the system and make this function alone. So if you run a two-sided platform like Amazon and Apple, you cannot also provide services on that same platform. That's the clarity that I want to bring back in the relation. That is what I mean with breaking them up. Then my final argument also has to do with deep pockets. Nicky Morgan was surprised that the EU can't bring lawyers to the table. But let's face it, the big tech put up a hell of a fight. And Thomas Soffoletti also rightly said, it's not just the legal side that they fight, also commercial, by having an aggressive takeover policy. Google Fitbit is one of the recent example. Facebook, WhatsApp, that bought WhatsApp and Instagram is also a classical one. But I want to point out another thing. If we have this concentration of market power and deep pockets, it will also impact politics and policy. Well, you may be sad or not, I don't know, depends on your political color, I suppose, that you lost Nick Clegg for British politics. I'm sad because you gave him to Facebook, right? And this is just the tip of the iceberg, the proverbial tip of the iceberg, because today I read, for example, that a commission servant took a leave for 1 year to work for a big tech company. Apparently that's possible. And that's what they also do. They have an impact on policy and on policy making by introducing lobbying, by hiring people to work for them. And with them, not just the companies themselves, but also the publishers and the advertisers that have grown dependent on companies like Google and Facebook. So it's not just the abuse of market power, it's also the use of market power and deep pockets to influence policies and politics that I take. And if you want to have countervailing power, we can't let it to be the individual who decide who controls the data. But we need to have a large, against large big tech, we need also a large countervailing power, for example, like the EU or the competition authorities in the US. So to end up, let's move fast and break them up.
Thank you, Paul, for that speech. We now turn to our second speaker for the opposition, James O'Malley, who is a freelance writer and journalist who's written in The Spectator, Politico, The New Statesman, The Telegraph and The Independent. After the Brexit referendum of 2016, he started a petition to declare London independent from the UK, which has almost 200,000 signatures. James, the floor is yours. Virtually.
I'm you.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me. I can't believe you found the London Independence thing. One day it will be a reality. Anyway, let me begin tonight by saying I'm enormously sympathetic to the emotional argument being made tonight. I find the idea of breaking up big tech a really appealing idea on a sort of gut emotional level, because I'm just as nervous about the power of big tech as everyone else. I think Mark Zuckerberg, Tim Cook, and Jeff Bezos probably do have too much power concentrated in their hands. And obviously, I recognise that big tech does loads of bad things. We've mentioned several of the sort of bad outcomes from their behaviour already this evening. They behave in monopolistic ways. Apple has an App Store monopoly on the iPhone. Google and Facebook do scary things with our data. The people who work in Amazon warehouses often have to work in difficult conditions for long hours, and that's been hugely controversial as well. And you know, I also recognise the people proposing breaking up big tech are really smart and thoughtful people, as we have seen tonight. In the last election, my favourite candidate, in the last American election, my favourite candidate was Elizabeth Warren, who is probably more synonymous than any other politician around breaking up big tech. So if the proposition... that's just to set out my stall to go, I get it. I think I understand the arguments or why people are making these arguments. And if the proposition tonight was, should we regulate big tech really hard, then I would probably be standing on the other side of this debate. But I do think that, to go back to the proposition of breaking up big tech, I think this is a little bit of a red herring. I think because it's such a big issue, because these companies play such important roles in our lives, it's important to be precise and ask ourselves, what problem are we actually trying to solve here? And will this proposed solution actually do anything in order to solve it? And I'm a bit skeptical that breaking up big tech will actually be the magic bullet we want. So let me start by talking on a practical level. So how do we actually break up these companies? So someone on the floor of the union raised this earlier, and this is a really important point, because so let's take Facebook for example. Their acquisition of Instagram and WhatsApp created this corporate behemoth. It's an enormous company. WhatsApp and Instagram each have 1 billion users of their own. Facebook has 2 billion. So if you, on a practical level, you were to go, well, let's just break it up. Let's just split them into 3 companies. They'll still be enormous, powerful companies. The problem is, behind the scenes, these 3 platforms, though they look different, are basically very tightly integrated. Since Facebook acquired the companies, they've merged all the back-end infrastructure. When you're sending a WhatsApp message or sending a Facebook Messenger message or direct messaging someone on Instagram, it's the same code on the same servers in the background, which is doing all of that clever stuff. It's basically different window dressing in the form of different apps on the same underlying code. In the same way, so Facebook and Instagram, they share advertising infrastructure behind the scenes, so that advertisers who advertise on Facebook can then put their adverts onto Instagram with the click of a button, is the phrase Facebook uses. It's the same thing. It's not a thing that can be easily separated. Another example of a difficult separation could be Google and YouTube. In this debate over the years, people point to YouTube being the dominant video platform, thinking, well, that could just be carved off of Google, because there's a sort of logic to it, because YouTube is a dominant player in online video, and weirdly, it's actually the 2nd biggest search engine after Google itself. So you'd think that would be a sort of slam dunk case for breaking the 2 apart to sort of stimulate competition. But the problem is, they ultimately, again, under the hood, they basically are very similar. So YouTube's recommendation algorithm, that's the reason, you know, when it says, you've watched this, now watch this, and the reason you're, oh, okay, just one more video, just one more video, just one more video. The reason that works is because it's powered by what Google call Google Brain. This is the company's sort of generalized artificial intelligence system. So again, like the example with Facebook Messenger and Instagram Messenger and WhatsApp, it's again, sort of slightly different shop fronts on much of the same sort of thing inside and under the hood. So, sorry, that's a mixed metaphor, but I'm sure you get the gist of what I'm saying there. So, simply put, while it might be sort of moderately straightforward in the sort of analog world to divide up a company that seems like a monopoly, so look at like the breakup of big oil or the telecoms in the United States in the last century, there was a sense and a logic to that, because you could do it by geography or by different business units in the company and stuff like that, and separate them out into different companies. But the nature of software is you write one piece of code once, and then you use that piece of code everywhere, and everything sort of is stuck together. So I think drawing them apart is actually a really difficult, really practical question. So if we are going to break up big tech, we need to actually figure out how to do it. So my second point this evening is, let's just imagine that problem goes away. I don't know. Regulators are very clever people. Politicians are clever people. I'm sure they can figure out a way to do it, maybe. My question then would be, though it would feel sort of really satisfying to see Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos knock down a peg or two, the smile wipes off of their faces. But how would it actually solve the underlying issues that we have with big tech? So look at Amazon, for example. I think one of the easier cases, or the more sort of logical cases for breaking a company apart, could be Amazon, because it's basically two companies in one. One half of Amazon is focused on retail and logistics. It's Amazon.com. It's the shopping site that we all know about and have used relentlessly during the pandemic. The other half of Amazon is maybe less well known outside of the tech world, is Amazon Web Services. It's Amazon's cloud platform. It's the digital plumbing that now runs an enormous swathe of the internet. And it's actually where Amazon makes most of its profits, or it's actually, it's bigger than the shopping side of Amazon, if you can believe that. And this infrastructure, this Amazon Web Services, actually sits underneath everything from Netflix to Twitter to Facebook. They all use Amazon Web Services. And so you might think, well, these could be two separate companies. What's wrong with that? But the problem is, in a lot of different domains, technology tends towards sort of natural monopolies. So imagine you had two different Amazons, one web services, one doing the shopping. Then I don't know how that would sort of stimulate competition in either of those domains, because ultimately, AWS would still be the dominant cloud platform, and then the dominant online retailer would still be Amazon. It wouldn't make either of those markets more competitive, as they still have dominant players. And let's say, I don't know, the person breaking up big tech, the person taking the axe down, took a more granular approach. Let's say they looked at what an earlier speaker raised, that was Amazon operating a two-sided marketplace, but then also selling its own products. Amazon has its own sort of white label, own brand stuff, a bit like a supermarket has its own brand products alongside other stuff. And one of the criticisms Amazon has received over the years is, well, does it secretly favor its own products? Does, when you search for something generic, like, oh, you need a new charger for your phone, is it saying, well, buy the Amazon charger for your phone before those of marketplace sellers? Maybe, okay, fine. You could say to Amazon, fine, you can no own brand stuff. That's got to be a separate company. Spin it off, sell it off, cut it off, however Amazon want to do it. But then ultimately, Amazon still control and own the marketplace. They still set the rules of the market, and so sellers, they're still the layer that sits between the customer and the seller, and that's still an enormously powerful position for them to be in. So I'm not entirely sure how that would sort of weaken Amazon's monopoly power in that respect. And then there's also the issue, I think, of, again, and the problem with tending to monopoly, I think the biggest and best example of this is with Facebook. So imagine Facebook and Instagram somehow were separated apart. Then what's to stop Mark Zuckerberg from launching a brand new photo sharing app and then using the 2 billion strong Facebook audience, which is just on the normal Facebook app, to drive users to it? What's to stop the Facebook app going, hey, here's Facebook's new Instagram 2, or whatever they call it? And it's hard to imagine, but this is basically exactly what Facebook did when they failed to buy Snapchat. So a few years ago, Snapchat was doing really well. That Facebook tried to buy them. Snapchat unusually said no to a big money offer. So what Facebook did, they basically, let's say they were inspired by some of the functionality of Snapchat and integrated a feature called Stories into Instagram. This was a thing Snapchat invented that when Snapchat was growing. But now Instagram does it, and everyone uses stories on Instagram. I say everyone, I'm over 30, so I've never used a story in my life. But that's why, as far as I understand it, everyone uses Instagram. And they basically just destroyed Snapchat, and it's basically a virtual irrelevance, because the problem is when you've got these sort of natural monopolies and these network effects, then winning begets winning. So even without Instagram, Facebook is still a long way ahead. And if Instagram was a separate company, yes, there'd be a fight, but one of them would eventually win. One of them would eventually get to the point where all of your friends are on one of the platforms versus the other, or slightly more, and that would have a snowballing effect. So you just end up a few years down the line with, oh, you've got another big monopoly player. So to me, that doesn't make much sense. Like, even if you could break things up in a smart way, and I'm sorry if I'm pushing for time here. Let's say you could split Facebook's advertising section off into a separate company or something. I don't really know quite how this would work, but the problem, that wouldn't solve any of the problems if you could hive off a bit of functionality, because the problem with Facebook isn't like how they're giving advertisers a raw deal or something like that, because people talk about Facebook's advertising power. The problem is that Facebook has consumed the entire public square and can now regulate speech and the boundaries of acceptable discourse and control our lives to a far greater extent. Simply breaking up parts of the company or breaking something up doesn't solve that problem, when again the network effects, the fact that everyone will just naturally get together to, I guess, argue in the same place, that's all I tend to do on Facebook, is a sort of a natural phenomenon. So I don't think breaking up works there. And finally, for my last point, I want to make maybe the most sort of counterintuitive point this evening, which is sometimes in tech, and I need to be very careful saying this, a monopoly can be a good thing. And I think the example of this is actually Apple's battle at the moment with Epic Games over the App Store. So Epic Games, they make Fortnite. Their complaint is that Apple have too much control in the App Store. They force merchants on the App Store to give Apple a 30% cut. They decide what apps go on there. They set the rules and all this sort of thing. Apple play a very powerful role. Like they have a monopoly over apps that run on the iPhone. But the problem is, well, the thing is, the benefit is, this actually is brilliant for security. It means that you can buy an iPhone, even if you know nothing about computing, even if you're, you don't need to care. If you go on the App Store and search for Netflix and download an app called Netflix, that's real, 100% legit Netflix. That's not some dodgy scam app. Also, it's just been called Netflix. And by Apple having this dominant role where they set the rules and enforce everything, that means we've got that trust, and that's what arguably has enabled the iPhone and mobile phones more generally to grow just as much as their portability. They're this reliable thing we can trust our entire digital lives with. Years ago, before the old way of doing computing with Windows and things being more open, and there are virtues to that approach, but it just meant, I remember, I'd want to download a bit of software to do something. I'd just download some random app from the internet, click on whatever it is .exe, and goodness knows what that could have done to my computer, because there was no way of vetting that code. So there is a sort of benefit there. So again, I'll skip over the end. I think I've probably gone over my allotted time, but basically my argument is this. I get it. I think the emotional case is there. I understand big tech is a problem and we need to do something. And ultimately, that's going to involve a more fine-grained approach. It's going to be about looking at the different impacts big tech has on the world and working out, should we be regulating that and how should that be regulated? I think breaking up big tech, again, it's an appealing phrase, it's an appealing idea emotionally, but it doesn't really solve the problem. It's just a nice sounding phrase until someone can work out how to actually do it and whether it will actually do anything. So maybe we need to be more like Silicon Valley, ironically, and think of a more sort of innovative solution to this problem instead. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for that speech. We now move on to our penultimate round of paper speeches. So we turn now to continue the case for the proposition to Rory Cullen-Jones, who is the technology correspondent for BBC News. His publications include .bomb, The Rise and Fall of .com, The Secret History of Social Networking, and Always On, Hope and Fear in the Smartphone Era. Most importantly, however, he is a graduate of Jesus College, Cambridge. Rory, The floor is yours. A microphone is on its way.
I might even take my mask off. Ladies and gentlemen, and benighted denizens of Zoom, you poor devils. Hey Siri, set a timer for 8 minutes. Nobody tell me I'm in the hands of big tech. 8 minutes and counting. Okay, fine, thank you very much. I've got to say, when I got the invitation to come and speak in this debate, I was a bit terrified and I thought this is a really, really bad idea. Why? Because yes, more than 40 years ago, I was a member of this august body. I sat on those benches, marveling at the articulacy and the smoothness of the young men, and it was mostly young men, auditioning for parts in the cabinet, which many of them would proceed to in the following years. And I thought I would never dare to follow in their footsteps and actually get up and speak. It was one of those kind of things you dreamt about and had nightmares about. And since looking at the history of this place, how can I compete with speakers from Churchill to Reagan, from Judi Dench to Jesse Jackson, to Marcel and Gabby from Love Island? The oratory has rung around this chamber for more than 200 years, so it's claimed, and I can't possibly match it. That's what I thought. Plus, there's the fact that as a BBC correspondent, I've got impartiality in my blood. Who am I to call for the breakup of the tech giants? You may find me changing sides halfway through. So all sorts of reasons for not accepting this invitation. And it's got worse as the evening has progressed, because our team has been led off by Tommaso and then Paul, the Kevin De Bruyne and Phil Foden of the field, with a great contribution for our side, I thought, from James O'Malley just now, because most of his arguments seem to be on our side. And I feel, I don't know if anybody remembers, you probably don't, Ron Harris, the Chelsea, Ron Chopper Harris. I feel like him taking to the field. So I won't have any elegant arguments, but I may cause a bit of mayhem. But I did think of two great reasons for accepting this invitation. First, a chance to leave the attic where I spent most of the last year and actually get out and meet some people. And you're all looking lovely, by the way, even in your masks. And second, and the best reason possible, I've a book to plug. And anyone will know that a man with a book to plug will do anything. Last night it was the East Hampshire Libraries podcast. Tonight it's almost as good a gig, the Cambridge Union. So fine. So here we go. As you've heard, the argument for action against what have variously been called the FANGs or GAFA is absolutely compelling. Let me read you some headlines from the last month. Facebook sales and profits leap as ad prices rise. Alphabet, the owner of Google and YouTube, posted revenue of $55 billion, up 34% from a year earlier, and net profit more than doubled to $18 billion in the first quarter. First quarter, mind. Amazon continued to cash in on our new shop, work, relax from home habits in the first 3 months of this year, reporting a huge rise in sales and a tripling of profits. Apple said its profits more than doubled to $23.6 billion in the most recent quarter, as people embraced its latest iPhones, what are they, and bought more of its other products, striking results for what's already the world's most valuable company. So, what have we been through in the last year? We've been through a really hard time. All sorts of businesses have been teetering on the verge of oblivion. Meanwhile, the tech giants have been making hay while the sun doesn't shine. They have prospered mightily. Just have a look at the market over the last year. And after a sickening plunge in the NASDAQ last March, most of those companies have reached record highs. The market is saying these companies can only go in one direction, and that's up. And that's left them with huge, unaccountable power. Let's have a look at those powers that they've got, what they're doing with their might and their wealth. Apple, as I said, the world's most valuable company, taking advantage of its control of its app store to harvest huge profits from developers and consumers. Now in a mud-wrestling battle, as you heard, with the makers of Fortnite and the EU. Google and Facebook, between them, controlling 2/3 of the mobile advertising market, the most important market that's emerged over recent years, the lifeblood of the internet, effectively, and controlled effectively by two giant corporations. That gives them immense power. Google, of course, via its dominance of search, is the judge and jury over the fate of every small business. One tweak in its algorithm, in its search algorithm, and they're dead. I did a whole radio program a few years back on the power of the Google search algorithm, talking to weeping business owners who had bought the term large shoes, a large shoemaker, and one tweak in the algorithm, and they disappeared from the front page, and their business was effectively dead. Huge unaccountable power. Meanwhile, Facebook, with its 2.5 billion worker ants, I'm talking about you, is harvesting an ocean of data for use by its customers, the advertisers, to slice and dice and send out messages selling you everything from milkshakes to Donald Trump. And it's working. We've seen how it's worked over the last 4 years. In this fine book, I interviewed Tim Berners-Lee, who I've spoken to many times over the years, who retained an extraordinary optimism about his creation, the web, for many years. And I said, when did that stop? And he basically came out with 2 words, Cambridge and Analytica, which kind of laid bare to him, he said, the sheer power of platforms like Facebook and the fact that they could have such an impact on our society. Amazon, the dominant online shopping force. And while it's a great place to buy a copy of Always On, a better place is your local independent bookshop. But why didn't we see all this coming? Because it all happened quite suddenly. It started in 2007 with an amazing event, the unveiling of the iPhone by Steve Jobs. I was in the hall when it happened in San Francisco. And at that time, yes, Google and Apple were already big players, as was Amazon, but power was spread a bit more broadly. If you think about the mobile phone industry back then, 2007, Nokia of Finland had 40% of the market, was the giant. Others around the world had a share of the market. Big mobile operators like Orange and Vodafone were players. But we then sat back and watched as the US giants dominated this new era of smartphones and social media. We let them buy up rivals. We let Facebook buy Instagram, buy WhatsApp. It seems extraordinary now. We let Google buy the UK's great white hope that nobody'd heard of when they got it, DeepMind, the artificial intelligence company. We let them move into new areas, Google into driverless cars, Amazon obviously into web services, and Prime Video into Echo speakers. This week, Amazon's buying MGM Studios. We've sat back and we've let it happen. And all the while, we didn't complain because their services were either brilliant or free. I thought it was interesting, we heard from Baroness Morgan a convincing, semi-convincing, extremely lawyerly argument. She used the cry of the monopolists everywhere, but everybody loves us. Everybody loves their free Facebook. Everyone loves the efficiency of Amazon. That is how we are gently smothered in the embrace of the tech giants. They're woven into our lives. I got up this morning, I shouted at Alexa, I jived a bit with my Google Home, I bought train tickets on my mobile phone via my iPhone, I WhatsApped my friends. I've had thousands of interactions today with the denizens of the companies that are based all in one small part of the earth, the west coast of the United States. And it's got to stop. It's time to stop. No more deals. No more acting as if borders don't matter. It's time to cut them down to size. Only after you've gone on Amazon and bought my book. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory, for your characteristic wit and wisdom. We now turn to our first student speaker from the floor, or rather, from our first student paper speaker, Sayfullah Shah, who is a first-year student. Oh, sorry, James. James Appiah, who is a first-year student reading HSPS at Pembroke. He won this slot through open audition. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll be debating in opposition of this motion that this House will break up big tech. Before I begin my argument, let's define some key terms. To understand the term breaking up, we need to first understand big tech. Big tech usually refers to the oligopoly of tech companies which have most of the market control in the tech industry. Many, as do I, like to refer to these companies as GAFAM: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. There are other companies which could come under this umbrella of big tech: Foxconn, Huawei, and Hitachi. But GAFAM are the main players when it comes to big tech. Many argue they have most of the control in the tech market. Breaking these companies up essentially means hindering them from getting any bigger and primarily stopping them from making the tech market anti-competitive. For markets to stay healthy, you want competition. This includes low barriers to entry, many players within the market, and lastly, individual players not being able to contribute significant amounts to the overall market. Those who are against the formation of big tech companies argue that these companies are monopolies which hinder competition. We are all aware of the notorious problems of big tech. They cause market failure, they're the behemoths of surveillance capitalism, and they have a severe addiction to data collection and tax avoidance. Some even go on to argue, as Professor Vellatali did, that they threaten our beloved democracy. I would like to argue 3 points today. First, that breaking up big tech does not solve the problem of market failure in the tech industry. Second, that breaking up big tech does not solve the problem of surveillance capitalism. And lastly, that there's a better alternative to breaking up big tech. On the point of market failure, the markets we currently have doesn't necessarily allow big companies to continue to dominate everything. Big tech is a complex world, whereby places like MySpace are no space today, and places like Bebo are below, simply because they couldn't keep up with competition. If you were to look on a timescale, the dominant players in the market 20 years ago are not the same dominant players now, and are probably not going to be the same dominant players 20 years from now. Despite this dynamic look of the market, those on the proposition may convince you that the markets are failing. But what does that actually mean? Well, economically, it means that there's an inefficient allocation of goods and services in the industry. But more practically, whatever the likes of Google or Amazon does, it has a major effect on the rest of the industry. Take a look at the stock price as an example, which is the highest amount someone is willing to pay for a particular stock or the lowest amount it can be bought for. According to Forbes, Amazon's stock price went up by 58% from January 2020 to January 2021, after the World Health Organization declared the global health emergency of the coronavirus. Despite this, during the same period, the S&P 500, which is the stock market index of 500 of the largest companies listed on stock exchanges in the United States, had a decline of about 2%. Does this look like market failure to you, or does this look like a company which is accumulating massive amounts of data and is now using that data to create huge revenues? Let's look at the example of IBM. IBM was required to leave or split off its service bureau business in 1956. And then in 1969, the United States of America alleged that IBM violated the Sherman Antitrust Act by monopolizing or attempted to monopolize the general-purpose electronic digital computer system market. This monopoly was said to potentially have long detrimental impacts by disrupting innovation and hampering the growth of new businesses. However, this was heavily disputed. William Baxter, the Attorney General in charge of the Antitrust Division of the United States Department of Justice, who caused the breakup of AT&T, realized that after breaking up AT&T, which was the best telecommunications service in the world, it then led it to become a third-rate company. William Baxter, with some sort of prejudice, dropped the 13-year-old case against IBM in 1982, calling it meritless. However, during that period, IBM's innovation slowed down. It began selling off parts of its operating systems to companies such as Microsoft and Apple, and as we all know, this helped pave the way for a new set of innovation. The breaking up of IBM in 1982 didn't help increase competition because it didn't happen. It was the consumers who took a step back on IBM services because they felt it was a monopolistic monster. It was also IBM voluntarily selling off and sharing parts of its products to smaller competitors. This point is key to remember because we will come back to this on my last point on alternative solutions. Moving on to the second point, surveillance capitalism. Shoshana Zuboff's book, which was published around 3 years ago, called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, opened our eyes to deep, insincere, and rather scary world of the tech leviathans. In chapter 15 of her book, she uses the term instrumentarian power. This is the power of governments and big tech companies to use technology to manipulate us in subtle ways for selfish and political goals. This power is welcomed by society because it fills a void of trust which has been diminished by the government and individuals amongst ourselves. Surveillance capitalism replaces the trust with certainty of outcomes, not just for markets, but for society itself. Our data is being used for political goals and other deviants which are beyond our wildest dreams. However, breaking up big tech does not solve this problem. In fact, I would argue that it enhances it. For instance, Facebook will have to sell off Instagram, WhatsApp to create totally different platforms and a split-off acquisition. Creating separate units of these big tech companies would mean less finances, less public updates, and more vulnerability to international cyber attacks. Whether it is good or bad, we can almost feel what companies are doing with our data that we give them. But to slaughter them away to the point they scurry away into the shadows will not only make things worse, but make us as the consumer unsafe. In some other form, these companies will continue to exist if they are broken up and will manage to continue to exist as oligopolies within the market. Already, some of these big tech companies have paid fines, which are in the billions, and still continue to do business as it is. Google, Apple, Intel, you name it. So if breaking up big tech is not the solution, then what is? I recommend you all a book called Reinventing Capitalism in the Age of Big Data by Victor Mayer-Schomburger, an Oxford professor, who argues that the solution to big tech, to the problems of big tech, is a progressive data sharing mandate between big tech companies and smaller competitors. Big tech companies hold so much power, as we know. They primarily generate massive amounts of data, and this data creates digital moats around their businesses. Don't break up the companies, just build bridges around their moats. In other words, enable the big tech companies to share their data with smaller competitors. This is already taking place gradually. Last year, on the new EU proposals, the EU Commission said in order to break down monopolies such as Google and Amazon, that would explore legislative means to push companies towards sharing and pooling its data. After all, bigging up big tech companies with their data reduces the value generated from that data. A good example of this is Google Street View. It allows companies like Uber and Ola Cabs to run its services via digital roadmaps. If you split Google into smaller segments, you're reducing the ability to use that data. That only hinders Google's ability to grow and innovate, but has a collateral effect on other companies who use that data too. Big tech companies could securely share their internal data with smaller competitors without revealing their sensitive data in the process. Smaller competitors could commute on big tech data troves without ever seeing the raw data level. It is plausible to facilitate a data sharing mandate whilst maintaining the highest privacy and security standards. How can we ensure that these smaller competitors don't exacerbate the privacy issues that we already have? Well, privacy isn't a single issue. It's a kaleidoscopic, complex range of problems. One of them is the concentration of data. Limiting the concentration of data through data sharing could do better to protect us from the big tech rather than breaking them up. Who would have thought that digital socialism would be some sort of solution to digital capitalism spiraling out of control? In summary, remember, breaking up big tech does not solve market failure. It does not stop surveillance capitalism. There's always a solution when it comes to big tech, and in this case, it is progressive data sharing mandate. It is digital socialism. Because of these arguments, I beg to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, for your speech. We now turn to our final speaker for the proposition, Ewan Woods, who is a first-year student reading HSPS at Corpus Christi. Ewan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. I feel like I've been given rather a difficult task right now. I've just had before me an academic, an MEP, a journalist, and here I am, an overconfident fresher, trying to live up to that. But I'll do the best I can, and I think I can give an interesting dynamic. We've heard from people who regulate these industries, we've heard from people who've commented on these industries for years and years and years, but I'm just a user. I've only ever been at the point of a user, and I think from that perspective, there is no clear alternative other than to break up these giant tech companies we've all had to rely on. Now, I don't know exactly what the select committee had to do to get this debate organized, but I feel fairly confident in betting that at a minimum, or at a maximum rather, 3 companies were involved in it. Google for organizing debates, streaming them on YouTube, and emailing out everyone who needed to. Apple to create the phones and the computers who we use to get in contact with these speakers and with these great academics. And Microsoft to create the spreadsheets to organize them on a weekly basis. And even then, that is a gross overstatement. You could do that with one company. You could do that with Google. You could use a Google phone and create Google Documents and use Google Mail to share them on Google Drives and organize this all through Google's video streaming platform, YouTube. We're increasingly seeing a world where the internet is becoming more important. The pandemic's made that especially clear, as a good chunk of our speakers are coming through us on Zoom, and this is all being live streamed to a good chunk of our audience on YouTube. And as we see this growing prominence in the internet, questions need to be asked about the role in which we want big tech to play. And the more we see these companies grow, the more we see parallels to times where we've had to ask these questions before. The obvious one, and the point that's been made by James O'Malley earlier, is big oil, Rockefeller. But even then, I wouldn't say Rockefeller had as big a control over his customers as Jeff Bezos does over his currently. I mean, even just 3 major big tech companies, Amazon, Alphabet, and Facebook, have collective revenues annually of $600 billion, larger than 172 national economies. Their founders, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, make up the 1st, 4th, and 5th richest people, respectively, on the planet. These companies are vast and will continue to get bigger unless there's some sort of regulation, as the internet continues to connect us more and more, and as parts of the world which haven't seen the internet get slowly plugged into the giant network we're building.
If I may.
Sure, go ahead.
You say you're worried about the amount of power and...
Sorry, can you wait till the microphone comes to you? Thank you.
You say you're worried about the wealth and the power that these CEOs or ex-founders have on the society as a whole, but how would breaking the companies up in more pieces would help that? Because you've got shareholders in one company that will become shareholders in many companies. Take the most obvious and the most famous example of a breakup of the Rockefellers that you just mentioned. They were already wealthy, but after this they become even more wealthier. How would that work? Thank you.
Right. That's better. Yeah. There is definitely concern about that. I'm not going to be blind about that. But I think you can be clever about the way that you break these companies up. It's not just a matter of slicing and dicing them, as been suggested previously by the opposition. I think you have to cut finely with what industries you cut off. Some of them won't survive on their own. And you also have to be careful about who's involved in them to make sure you're not just handing money over to different shareholders in different companies. Don't know why I closed this. It's just going to make it more difficult. Love paper, very useful. So tonight, to get back on point, I'm hoping to convince you that there are 3 key elements that we need to be focused on. The size and wealth of these companies, as we've already started to address, and the fact that they can just monopolize the online space. With this monopolization comes massive data collection and how that can be used and misused. And not only does the data and the size of these companies give the control over the online space, but the control which is starting to spew out into the traditional footholds of offline industries further shows why breakup of these industries is becoming more and more vital. Now, any layman who has a basic knowledge of Silicon Valley will know that big tech is big. And this has allowed it to dominate much of the internet landscape. through YouTube, Google dominates most online video traffic with 34 billion visits in the United States last year, and their biggest competitor, Dailymotion, managed 178 million by comparison. And let's be honest, the Daily Motioners aren't exactly a major industry we need to worry about. The same is true with Google, getting 92 billion visits a year compared to Yahoo's 3 billion. Amazon is now the dominant bookseller in the world, as has clearly been shown several times tonight. And it is slowly becoming one of the largest retailers, full stop, online or brick and mortar. The growing size of these brands is going to make them more and more of an issue, especially as they start to spew out into other industries like Prime Video. And as this influence grows, its overwhelming impact will be felt, and rival growth is going to just be impossible. If you want actual competition and actual fairness, as the opposition and the proposition has clearly stated is a good goal to have, we need to break up these companies to ensure that can happen. And through this domination on a sheer size of visits, it leads to a domination of virtually every other aspect of the internet, where there's not a hit for Google on the face level. Capture, the I am not a robot button, if you've not heard of it before, is embedded in basically every website with a login function. Facebook allows you to log into most, or Facebook is allowed to be used as a login for most other sites. And Twitter is effectively the only way that you can make your voice known as a public figure, as I'm sure Baroness Morgan would be able to tell us if she was here in person. But with this massive influence comes massive data collection in order to manage these online systems. Amazon algorithm makes you purchase more and more products that you think you'll like. Google's capture systems can train its self-driving robots to do hundreds and thousands of other things that we can only fathom, as we're barely told anything about the use of these systems and of these algorithms. And Facebook is willing to sell most of your data to the highest bidder. The relationship, between Facebook and Cambridge Analytica that has been mentioned earlier tonight makes that clear, with it being a vital aspect of the Brexit referendum and the election of Donald Trump. If these vast hauls of data can be used to win elections, even if they're being done in the cleanest and most legal manners, they can be easily just as used to spread misinformation or scams or malicious content or things that we can't even dream of at the moment as the internet grows bigger and bigger and more innovation and more fields sprout up. And this can all be done with little cost. And as these companies grow bigger, it will become all the simpler to misuse their functions. Now, as this big tech and its data could be misused, divisiveness can grow, and the way in which its algorithms can be used to target us gets even more deeper and even more sophisticated. The YouTube algorithm is an excellent example of this. It has massive sway over content that is watched. Even the most minor change to it has led to situations where YouTube of, say, 2007, 2008 was dominated by 3-minute little skits of animators from Newgrounds and things like that. And now if we look at YouTube today, loads of nonsense of loud American influencers screaming about $10,000 challenges with massive Lamborghinis and giveaways to whatever big video game is out at the time. We can also see this with echo chambers, leading to situations which are slightly more banal in the case of Twitter being Twitter, and it can lead to more horrific situations, like those riots which we saw on the 6th of January at the US Capitol. It's been well documented that Facebook has been used in planning these things and getting people into very, very small and radical and minute groups where the same ideas grow to fester as no alternative can be breaking in. And this can even be seen with YouTube, where the algorithm's job to feed you just one more video, as James O'Malley said, can lead to radicalization and the growth of far-right content online. If we want to actually get an interest of opinions in our daily lives, we'll need to just break up these monopolies which allow us to be fed the same content over and over and over again. And as we see the growth online, we fail to address the growth in other industries, which I think has been an issue which the opposition has not been able to tackle. Google just isn't search engines. It develops Android, one of the most vital phone operating systems outside of Apple. It owns YouTube, the largest online video platform, as I've mentioned. And it experiments in smartphones, in video games, and self-driving cars. The money that these companies can just throw around like it's nobody's business allows them to find success in most industries. Amazon's purchase of MGM has already been mentioned. I think Amazon Prime Video is a further point on that, where Amazon, which was just in its heyday, or in its early days, a bookseller, can now grow into the market, for lack of a better word, and start to dominate cinema, especially as cinemas have only just begun to open up once again. And even into more conventional industries like journalism, which you wouldn't expect to be dominated by big tech, Amazon has a hand again, not only through, in other sites, through the promotion of certain papers, but Amazon now owns the Wall Street Journal. And I think when we're getting to a point where tech companies can just buy up papers, we can get to a case where these companies are far too big. So in close, because I've been told that I'm talking for England once again, I think it's quite clear that we have an issue with these companies. And slicing up some of their industries and some of their subsidiaries is vital in ensuring that we can have a market which is fair, which doesn't monopolize us as consumers, and allows for new innovation to sprout up. And yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ewan, for making the closing case for the proposition. We now turn to our final speaker for the night, Saifullah Shah, who is a first-year law student at Downing. Saifullah, the floor is yours.
I begin my speech not with invective, but with praise. I can see that the proposition has illustrated the pervasive influence big tech exerts over our lives. They have demonstrated that given said influence, big tech is something that this House should rightly be concerned about. And most importantly, they've put forward a compelling argument for why big tech as it currently operates is far from ideal. But I must ask, is this the motion we are debating tonight? The motion is not this House dislikes big tech, nor is it this House would reform big tech. No, the motion specifically mandates that we commit these companies to the flames. And to say otherwise is merely to advocate an alternative, less radical solution. To paint loyalty to the opposition as blanket support for big tech in its entirety is to construct a false dilemma. And I caution against allowing the proposition to cast dust in your eyes through a specious portrayal of the motion. To lay bare the naivety of the proposition, I urge you to envision the world they wish to bring about, their Luddite utopia, a world in which the big tech companies are no more. That essay you typed up on your MacBook, ready to submit through Microsoft Outlook, in preparation for your supervision on Microsoft Teams, no more. The textbook you've ordered on Amazon, lost in transit. Perhaps you wish to express your excitement for being back in this chamber on Instagram. Perhaps you find my speech so impressive you feel compelled to submit a laudatory camfess. If only you could. And for our guests who made their way here using Google Maps, I'm afraid your journey home will be far longer than you had planned for. If the proposition honestly expects scattered successor companies, without the power nor resources of their predecessors, to build a new world upon the ashes of the old, then their vision is quixotic and their ambition Sisyphean. Having reminded you of exactly what you are voting on, I devote the remainder of my speech to my underlying argument, that the existence of big tech does not necessarily entail its evils, and that it is reform rather than destruction which will illuminate the future and its fruits. One may argue that these companies provide a platform for hate speech and disinformation, that they exploit our personal information, and that they exert undue influence on society at large. Addressing each point in turn, I shall demonstrate that breaking up big tech is a solution that is both infeasible and undesirable. Now, one of the cardinal sins attributed to these companies is the platform they provide for hate speech and disinformation. These represent two great evils of the modern age and have admittedly grown in scope through the very same devices we use for more menial and innocent tasks. I need not remind the House of their exponential growth in recent years due to factors mentioned such as the rise of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum. But this raises an interesting point. Perhaps these issues have existed for as long as social media has, but its insidious proliferation is a far more recent phenomenon. Evidently, platforms like Facebook and devices like our smartphones do not necessarily entail widespread hate speech and disinformation. They are a reflection of ourselves, and the same tools that allow some to spew vitriol and nonsense allow others like us to hold them to account. We do not need to break up these companies if we can alter how their products are being used. And failing this, further solutions lie in regulation, not dissolution, as has been mentioned. Reform, not destruction. Similar controversy has arisen regarding the collection of our personal data by the companies mentioned thus far. This is a concern that justifiably invokes feelings of concern, as it threatens to eviscerate our very understanding of freedom and autonomy. I concede this is not something we ourselves have the power to transform, but it is certainly something that our elected representatives can and should do. There exists a universal right to personal autonomy and no corresponding right to corporate behemoths to undermine this in the pursuit of avarice. As such, almost 2/3 of countries worldwide have adopted some form of privacy legislation, and its influence is simply a matter of existence and degree. Current legislation is insufficient not for lack of ability, but for lack of will. And if big tech's consumers and their leaders took a firm stance against data exploitation, it would be significantly curtailed as a result. There are some who would deride this as vacuous idealism and entirely infeasible in practice. But in response, I say that if it is impossible for our elected representatives to regulate these companies, then the proposition's belief that we could somehow break them up is founded securely on a fairy's wing. The solution we advance exists beyond the realm of fantasy and is both pragmatic and sustainable. Reform, not destruction. My final point relates to the exceptional power these companies wield. There are few people who are not influenced by them in some shape or form, and the extent of this influence has only grown in recent years. Allegations of Russian influence in elections across the Western Hemisphere demonstrate the potential for social media platforms to be fertile ground in which the seeds of political discord can be sown. My prior discussion of legislative reform is equally applicable here. Stronger regulation of social media in conjunction with the restriction of data collection would be an effective defense against similar attempts at electoral manipulation. True, we could break up all the big tech companies to achieve a similar outcome, but amputation is rarely desirable when a simple cast would do. We must also not forget that these platforms have the potential to be a force for good and a catalyst for progress. A plethora of activist movements have gained momentum in recent years, largely due to the influence of social media, and there is no more potent force in educating and advocating in the modern digital world. The end of big tech may provide an obstacle to those who seek to undermine democracy and the rule of law, but it would also halt social progress in its tracks. This is too radical a solution for the House to adopt, and viable change lies elsewhere. Reform, not destruction. In some way, it is not the big tech companies that pose a risk to this House, but how they operate and how they are allowed to operate. To navigate our uncertain future, we must recall the legend of Icarus. We must spread our wings and soar, not with reckless abandon, but with caution. We must acknowledge the risks these big tech companies pose and avoid succumbing to the heat of hubris. Yes, we must avoid the sun's rays, but this does not entail diving headfirst into the sea. And similarly, it is through reform rather than destruction that the solutions to the issues the proposition raise may be solved. I discovered this event through Facebook. I was invited to speak here through Microsoft Outlook, and I wrote this speech last night on an iPad. This is possible today. It would be possible through our vision, but it would be but a forgotten dream in theirs. And I echo the words of Oscar Wilde in saying, "Never regret thy fall, O Icarus of the fearless flight, for the greatest tragedy of them all is never to feel the burning light."
Thank you so much for your articulate remarks this evening. I'll submit that CamFest after the debate. In this house, we vote using our feet. So what's now going to happen is that my wonderful side chairs are going to stand by each of those doors, and they will count you as you walk out. So if you agree with the motion, you believe that this house should break up big tech, you'll go through the... Is it the right-hand side, which is I? Yeah. You'll go through, sorry, my vision is slightly blurred by the lights, so slowly blinding me. You'll go through the right-hand side. If you disagree with the motion, you'll walk through the left-hand side, and if you're not quite sure, you'll walk through the middle. But first off, we must thank all of our speakers, both the ones who have joined us virtually and in person, as well as the floor speakers, for spending the evening with us. We really appreciate it. And those of you who are virtual, we look forward to welcoming you to Cambridge in the near future. So let's just have one final round of applause for all of our speakers. And just by way of a quick plug, I'm inspired to just plug the next few events. So we have the rapper Lady Leisha. That was not a confident plug. Coming this week, as well as Ian Dale, Max Fosh, the physicist Carlo Rovelli, the YouTuber Max Fosh, the entrepreneur Ben Francis, all ahead of next Thursday's debate. This House believes nothing should impede a woman's right to choose. So we hope you'll join us for some of those events. Until then, take care and have a great night. Thank you.